Welcome back to the Venture Podcast. Today we're joined by Sascha, the founder of GetMyBoat. We're super excited to be here today, and let's get into it. So Sascha, we'd love to hear about the early part of your entrepreneurial journey. You're super entrepreneurial. You founded a few companies now. I'd love to hear about what kind of person you were as a kid. What sorts of things did you like? What sorts of things did you enjoy?
So thanks for having me on the podcast, guys. James, Bryce. But so to go back, I have to give you some context about where I grew up. And I don't know if that's what made me the person I am, but it was a unique upbringing. So I grew up, for people that know the Bay Area, about an hour north of San Francisco, a small town on the coast. And why I mention that, it was known for the locals ripping down the sign into the town. So you have to take yourself back before Google Maps. People had regular maps, but when people drove, they actually had to use signs. And so the turnoff to the town had the sign of Bolinas, and every time the county put up the sign, it was ripped down within 12 hours or shot with a shotgun. Yeah. So it was a small hippie town on the coast of in Marin County. So it was very secluded from that perspective, and I grew up a bit on a farm and raised lots of animals, raised chickens, etc. But it was very isolated. And then when I went to high school, it was in San Francisco, and I commuted back and forth every day. So it definitely was part of who I am in terms of my upbringing. I don't know if that's good, bad, indifferent, but it definitely was a bit counterculture and a bit hippie-ish at the time.
Did you have a first business, like any high school businesses that you had as a student, perhaps before your time at Berkeley?
No. Okay. So, I mean, I can just start right away by saying I've founded or been a part of a startup and 3 companies, and I didn't realize that I wanted to be an entrepreneur till well late into my 20s. And so even though I had just talking to James, I had a thirst for adventure and travel and doing different things. In high school, I went to a small private high school. I was a country boy that was commuting an hour each way, trying to find myself, playing sports, but I was just trying to get by. It was a very competitive high school, very hard. And so I was behind academically for a couple of years, and that was my only focus, was just staying above keeping my head above water. And the idea of doing anything entrepreneurial. You also have to go back in time, guys. So you guys are part of a generation, the people that are listening to your podcast are part of a generation where entrepreneurship is a word and a career path, right? Yeah. This was not something that people talked about back in the 80s or 70s, 80s, and 90s. In the 90s, it started to change. Yeah. It's a very different time now. So this is not something that most young people would consider as a career path. So,
very cool. So eventually you get good enough marks, you end up at UC Berkeley, right?
Yes.
What was that experience like, and how different was it from your upbringing?
Well, I always knew I wanted to go to UC Berkeley. Yeah. I was actually accepted at a couple other places, an Ivy, went and visited, but I so coming from a small country area, small private high school in San Francisco, Berkeley to me was exactly what I wanted. A massive university, it was 30,000 students, big sports program, big football program. I played lacrosse in high school, wanted to play lacrosse at Berkeley. Yeah. And if you've ever been on campus, it's just a mass of energy and craziness and individuals doing their thing. And I just couldn't think of something more exciting and a better place to go for college. So.
And then you get towards the end of your time at UC Berkeley. What were you thinking about? You said you had a knack for traveling, and is that exactly what you did, or were you considering like a corporate career directly after graduation?
Definitely not a corporate career. So at Berkeley, I had an interest in public service, and so my junior year, I applied with the FBI in the Department of State to do an internship between my junior year and my senior year, 3rd and 4th year at university. And because of some of the travels I had in Russia previously, my clearance was withheld initially. I was pulled into a small office, the FBI office in San Francisco. They grilled me on my trip and some contacts I had in Moscow at the time. This is the late 80s. Gorbachev was in power. They were just opening the country. So because of that, I went and did an internship on Capitol Hill and actually graduated in 3.5 years. I spent the first half of my senior year at Berkeley working on Capitol Hill because they asked me to continue my internship into the fall. I worked with Joe Biden on the Judiciary Committee, not for his office, but he was on the Judiciary Committee. So back in the day when he was in the Senate, I got a firsthand experience with that. So it led to, when I graduated, I had this, I wanted to do different things. And so I didn't have the means that I could just go travel. Again, traveling back at that time was much more expensive and more difficult. So my graduation present, to get to your question, my graduation present from my parents was a one-way ticket to London. Of course, later I asked, why was it one way? was there some deeper meaning there? Perhaps we won't get into that on this podcast. That's not the focus. So I worked as a bartender in London for 3 months. I worked as a personal trainer, taking my lacrosse expertise and physical fitness expertise in Paris for a year. And then from there, after some time, went to Japan and worked with a joint venture between a Japanese trading company and Dreyer's Ice Cream, and worked there in Tokyo for 3 years. And that was the first real corporate job I had. Obviously, I'd worked on Capitol Hill, but the legislative world is in public policy is very different.
Yeah.
So
the transition to the joint venture in your time in Japan, what was different about that? Maybe in terms of like cultural experiences, how did that change your perspective coming back, as to being, I guess, an American businessman?
So, I mean, everything is different in Japan, but I'll give you my daily life. After a bit of time, I moved into an all-male Japanese dormitory that the trading companies, they would have their salarymen, what they called salarymen or professionals, that lived in Osaka would be working in Tokyo, but during the week they had to stay in a dormitory. So I was given access to this dormitory. So it was an all-male, all Japanese, I was the only foreigner, dormitory where no one spoke English. Wow. And to give you a sample of how different it was, my kids love this story, I think. But so every morning or evening, the washroom where you showered was public. Right? There was no privacy. So this idea of Canadian or American privacy didn't exist. Yeah. And so you had a communal area where you sat on a little stool and washed yourself. And, back in the late 80s, early 90s, I was somebody that they were not used to. And so I was looked at every time I walked in. I'm like, after 6 months, guys, I'm the same, watching me. So having to learn the language, having to work in an environment like that, and the office was all Japanese, and at the time Japan was much less open it was doing very well economically, but much less open than it is now. It all influences who you are, and so I would say that experience was probably the hardest experience I've ever had in my life, and very much prepared me for adversity going forward.
And the single biggest challenge in your time in Japan, business-wise or personal, what was that for you?
So it actually became the essay of when I was applying to Harvard Business School was an ethical dilemma. And so it came about that my boss in Japan was actually embezzling money from the joint venture and from the trading company. Wow. And I didn't have absolute knowledge of it, but I knew that there were some things going on that weren't right, and raised this. And so I think raising that with the American side of the joint venture and them not recognizing that this was a real serious issue, they said, well, look, you're young, you just came into this company, our loyalty is with your boss. That was probably the single most difficult, at that time, the single most difficult obstacle I'd faced in my life, certainly professionally.
Yeah. And then what made you leave Japan to then go pursue your MBA?
So I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do in my 20s. It was great to work as a bartender, as a personal trainer. I'd worked on Capitol Hill. Now I was working at a joint venture in Tokyo, but I needed additional education. I had learned a lot on the fly. I'd learned about marketing and branding there in the company. And I knew that in order to have a career and have options and do other things, that I needed to go back to school.
Yeah. And was marketing and sales always kind of like a natural skill for you? And was that something you wanted to pursue? Like,
no, I mean, look, as a kid, I had things like a lemonade stand where we actually sold flowers. We had a neighbor that had an acre of daffodils, and we'd take those and sell those. And there's actually a picture of me in the San Francisco paper as a 10-year-old selling daffodils. But no, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I along the way, and this is advice I give people, you don't have to know what you want to do. And I think your generation and younger generation is much more programmed that way. And I continue to encourage people that are younger, you can go in different directions, but you absolutely do not know what you want to do at 18. We're all going to live, you guys are going to live till 90 or 100. You're going to have multiple careers, multiple interests. Don't get pigeonholed. And so, but along the way, pick up skills. So when I was in France, I became fluent in French. When I was in Japan, I was fluent in Japanese. I didn't know what the end goal was going to be, but I worked hard at where I was and what I was doing at that point. But in terms of sales and marketing, no, I mean, it was something I liked and I was good at, but it's something I gravitated to.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Could you speak to a bit about your experience at HBS, your time there? Perhaps some key lessons, maybe some, I guess, non-obvious ones that people wouldn't expect.
So, I mean, I'm very grateful that I was accepted at Harvard Business School. I had gratitude each and every day that I was there. I mean, my grandparents were Russian immigrants, and so to be on that campus and realize that that's the pinnacle. There's many pinnacles, but that was one of the pinnacles in higher education and business school. And incredibly fortunate to go from where my family started and to there in 2 generations. It could only happen in this country. And so that was the first thing. HBS was incredibly hard from somebody that didn't have a formal business background. I was with investment bankers. There's a lot of kids that come out of college and go into investment banking, go into consulting that, I didn't even know where the career office was at Berkeley, right? I was following this other path. And so to get matched up with kids like that in that environment was very, very stressful, very hard. It was a wonderful, I'm still friends with everybody from my class, but it was very, very hard. And so it taught me, again, the persistence that I had to pursue in Japan was probably very similar at HBS, but I think a lot of kids felt that way. When I visited the school before I applied and sat in on a class, which I always recommend that people do if they're interested in applying to schools, I realized I would be very fortunate to be in the middle of the class if I worked as hard as I could. And there was other schools that wasn't the case, but I thought, boy, if I kill myself 23 hours a day, I'm going to maybe be in the middle of this. And so that center and that place of excellence I'm very grateful for it. I don't think I have any lessons per se, other than if you are fortunate enough to be in an institution like that, and fortunate enough to take a pause in your career, right, for a couple years, grab onto it, take advantage of that, be grateful for it, enjoy it, work hard, but realize where you're at and what you're doing, and take advantage of that.
It's awesome that you stay present in a lot of the opportunities that you're in and you take full advantage of that. I think that's probably a great lesson that some people could get out of this.
One thing I'm actually curious on that note is when you're surrounded by all these bankers and consultants, like, did you almost feel a pressure to go into those industries that had that prestige?
So before you ask the second part of that, so I didn't know what investment banking or consulting was. I didn't know that they were bankers or consultants per se. I was just meeting people. I was struggling to get through the cases every day and be prepared in class and work out. And I was very fortunate. I had a very good study group, but I didn't know. I didn't know. And all these kids are going, in the first 2 weeks, they're starting to go to these presentations. And I was studying, right, trying to keep my head above water again. Again, much like high school. And so I did not fully understand what that meant. And so I think sometimes being naive is really powerful. So that was the first. I think you were going to ask something else, but.
Well, I know you then went on, I think, to go pursue a little bit of time with the NBA, right? That was your next job, which is like pretty cool. I mean,
it was so cool,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. It was like, okay, right. This is the dream job. I'm 28 years old. I've done all these things. I've been all over the world. And now, like, I play lacrosse, right? I love sports and sports marketing. I love marketing, branding, and the NBA, the National Basketball Association, was going to put me through a year-long program, a management training program, and then send me to be the second in command in Asia, in Hong Kong. So I interviewed for 8 hours at the All-Star game. They had a suite at the All-Star game in Atlanta, and I was interviewing there. I mean, you can't make this up, right? So this is why I went to HBS, was these opportunities are not open in general, and so I thought I had landed my dream job.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. Like, just the thought of like working for the NBA is really cool.
No, it is definitely a cool job.
It's so cool.
So what?
But it wasn't.
It wasn't.
It was terrible.
Okay.
It was the worst job I've ever had. Okay? So, and this is another lesson, right? Sometimes what you think is the end or the end all be all or the end of the rainbow, sometimes you grab that and it's not what you think it is. Yeah. And I certainly think that's true with a lot of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship and technology. It was horrible. It was very scripted, very top down, incredibly bureaucratic, run by the commissioner at the time, and who didn't like MBA students, even though he had started this program. Really brutal politics there. Yeah. Brutal politics. People that worked really hard sometimes just disappeared because of they got stabbed in the back. And I thought to myself, after a year of going through this and doing just PowerPoint after PowerPoint presentation, I worked on the WNBA. They had been out for a year. I said, there's just no way I can go to Hong Kong with an organization like this. The individuals I loved, but as an organization, it was incredibly toxic. Yeah. And subsequently, I've learned at the NBA or any league, if you want to do something, go to the team level, and that's where you can actually do things. But at the league level, it's much more difficult. So anyway, the lesson for me was, and so I quit. I quit before, a year in. I quit. I said, I can't take this anymore.
Did you quit without having a plan lined up?
I quit without having a plan.
Yeah.
And so that was like a really hard point in my life. So here, I 28 years old, had the dream job, just finished your education, a year into it, have student school loans. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
What are you going to do?
Mm-hmm. And then I guess the next step for you in the career trajectory was register.com, but between the MBA and that, how did you approach those next few months?
So it was a pretty dark, bleak type of again, thinking that you had found your passion and reason career-wise, professionally for existing, and then quitting from that and having no plan. It was pretty dark. Yeah. Soon after that, through school, I was introduced to it was called Foreman Interactive was the name of the company, and they did web hosting, web design, and they were just starting some in domain names called register.com. Mm-hmm. And so I was introduced to the CEO, young CEO, taking everyone back in time for a second. This is the early mid-90s, 97. So Netscape was just starting up. AOL was still was a big deal. Floppy disk, getting on the internet. It all was just starting to explode. Mm-hmm. Tech was starting to become and entering the consciousness in Silicon Valley. Previously, obviously, had been a big deal, but this was really starting that first technology, Web 1.0. Yes. And so to give it context, so I interviewed, he desperately needed people. I joined, and he said, why don't you start this register.com within this company? And, fast forward a couple of years and you can ask questions, but we took the company public. It was renamed Register.com. We got rid of the web hosting, got rid of the web design. Network Solutions had a monopoly in domain names at the time. We broke that monopoly. We were one of the first competitors and then went public in 2000. And so part of that first wave.
Yeah.
Did that, like after your first experience with technology and the .com boom, were you like, this is exactly what I want to do? I want to be in tech, or how did that make you feel?
It was more entrepreneurship and starting a business. So So I commuted to Brooklyn every day, and Brooklyn was, back at the time, it was basically factories. It was not the New York that we know today and the Brooklyn that we know today. And I'm dating myself through all this interview, but it's interesting. It's interesting times. And so they actually had an office in his dad's factory. And to give you some context, I'd come home after 2 months. I had to throw out my shoes because they were black. They had been white sneakers. They were black. We had no resources. We were trying to raise money. We had 30 people packed into a room. I mean, no joke. We had 10 people in a room like this. Wow. The quintessential door on a hobby horse, books propped up, and I absolutely loved it. You compare it to the NBA, right? With in the middle of Manhattan, on Fifth Avenue, and all the stars I dealt with, and dealing with taking Brandy around on All-Star Weekend. I absolutely loved it. It for the first time the light bulb went on that here's an opportunity. So first of all, again, the tech that all big companies were shuttering because they were being replaced by these startups, or they thought they were going to be replaced by startups. And so there was a tremendous amount of excitement and fear among the existing corporate hierarchy. And you had these young companies that were going public, Netscape, et cetera, at wild valuations. But for me personally, I was in charge of this group. I started hiring people. We raised money, but I ran everything. I ran sales. I ran marketing. I ran customer service. I worked with tech. I dealt with crises where we had only a few programmers. The CEO went on vacation and the server crashed because it was in Brooklyn, and a line was severed to Verizon. So this is what I want to do. I worked 14, 15 hours a day. I worked 7 days a week. I did customer service on weekends, and I absolutely loved it. Awesome. And so seeing something and building something from the ground up, I realized this is what I want to do for the rest of my life.
That's awesome. I'd love to dig deep on the strategy and maybe the Sascha playbook. You mentioned that.
Oh boy.
You guys one of the first to break that monopoly in the domain space. So
Yes.
I'd love to hear about your playbook, how you formed it at the time, and your strategies for saying where's the entry point, where's our wedge, and how do we expand from here?
So I mean, maybe we'll get to a bit of a playbook, a few startups down the road, because certainly at the time, and again, context is really important. I didn't have a playbook. We were a startup. We were struggling to survive. We were trying to break a monopoly. We were trying to build a brand. We were trying to do it with a bunch of young folks. This was my first startup. I was hiring people for the first time, and so putting those skills into action and learning what to do, being strapped for resources. I mentioned customer service because we couldn't afford to hire people. So there was no playbook other than, and what I taught people at the time, look, in a startup you have 1,000 things to do every day. Get them done. Get them done. And this may not be in vogue, and this, maybe was at the time, then it's more in vogue now that you listen to podcasts and you go to conventions and you go to shows and you go and take meetings. That's all taking time away from getting things done. Now, if you can do all those things and still work another 12 hours, but customer service emails had to be answered. Websites had to be done. They had to be redone, make it easier. How do we get people, using Register.com, and how do we get them through the process? Registering a domain name was something people didn't understand. What is a domain name? So all the process of getting that and making it accessible and easy for people takes a lot of work. Getting our name out in the press was a big part of the playbook of guerrilla marketing. And at the time, So the pinnacle was getting on the Today Show. The Today Show is a huge, news show here in the U.S. in the morning. So, of course, mistake. The day we finally got it, for 3 years we've been trying to get on the show. The day we got it, I had forgotten to tell the tech guys that we're going to be on the show. And we had a massive, massive spike. We didn't crash, but they came screaming up, what the heck is going on? We've just registered 10,000 domain names. The traffic is 2,000 times bigger than normal. What's going on? So anyway, back to in a startup, there's no safety net, or there's usually no safety net, and you've got to get 100 things done every day. So what's your focus, and what are you doing to move the ball forward? And that was really what we were trying to do in survival mode every day back then.
What do you think, like, obviously I think there's a theme throughout the podcast that you dealt with a lot of adversity in your early roles, and I imagine that played a big part in the startup, because in startups you're constantly dealing with adversity. But what do you think are the key skills that allowed you to develop and do a really good job in your role at register.com? Or was it just nothing really prepares you for the startup world? You just got to figure it out.
You get things done.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I think there is a theme of adversity and persistence in my upbringing, and I felt like an outsider, whether it was in high school or, even when I was working in London or Tokyo or Paris, I was an outsider, right? I was not part of that country or culture per se. I was a outsider. I was not an investment banker or consultant at HBS.
Yeah.
And yes, adversity, there's no substitute for adversity. And if you are going to be an entrepreneur, you are going to face tough times.
Yeah.
Period. End of story. That's just the way it goes. Yeah. There are incredibly rare and occasional stories of that not happening, but I think if you dig deep, you will find out that 99.9% of entrepreneurs have faced multiple points of company death and difficulties, and why am I doing this, etc. So I think my whole background in facing things and challenges head on gave me a thick skin from that perspective. And then I think I was very lucky that the education I got at HBS, which was a general education, I didn't focus in any one area. I learned finance, I learned accounting, I learned marketing, I learned organizational behavior. All those skills you need to pull in when you're starting something. So I think a platform or education that I was able then to pull on, because the other thing about a startup, particularly if you're the first or second or third person, you are not siloed, which I loved about a startup. I absolutely love this about business and creating businesses, is you've got to do the 100 things. You have to do 100 different things, and it's not the same. And so, doing press is not the same as doing customer service, which is not the same as programming, which is not the same as raising money, which is not the same as spending money, which is not the same as hiring. You've got to do all of that, which is awesome if you like that. So I think those are the two things that I would point to.
Gotcha. I guess now we could probably move on to Facil. Is it Facil or Facil?
Facil.
Facil, okay. Mm-hmm. So Facil is a defense tech company. You started it in the early 2000s. I'd love to hear about your journey with regards to why did you decide to I guess, pursue that industry? Did you approach it from a market standpoint, maybe with the HBS background, you looked at it from that? I'd love to hear how the idea came to be.
Yeah. So again, context. We had taken Register.com public. For a variety of reasons, I had decided to leave at that point and didn't know what I wanted to do next, which is another theme. But the overall tech environment was crashing. Register.com still exists, by the way. It's under either web.com or another firm. But I'm very proud of that fact. It was a great business model. Domain names was a great business model. GoDaddy did fantastic. They came after us, and I applaud what they did. We should have done that. But everyone else was kind of crashing, right? So a company before Register.com went public, Excite Home, offered to buy us, and 6 months later they were gone, right? So this is what was happening in 2000, 2001, 2002. I tell you this because There's an old expression Willie Sutton said, was asked why he robbed banks.
Could you say that again?
Willie Sutton
Yeah.
was asked, why do you rob banks? The answer is, that's where the money is. So I tell you this because in 2002, 2003, tech had been crushed, but the government still was spending lots of money in tech and infrastructure, and which is really popular now, defense tech. We were way ahead of the curve on that.
Yes.
And so my current business partner, we did Facile together. We did GetMyBoat together. We bought his company when I was at Register.com. He had proposed. He said, "Look, back in the '80s, we took a company public doing work with the U.S. government. Let's focus there." And so, combining the fact that we didn't know exactly what we wanted to do, we were doing some wireless work with telcos, and that had crashed. Focused on where the money was, and that was the industry that we focused on.
Yeah. And how does it differ from being, with Register.com, I'd imagine largely B2B services, maybe some consumers with their, personal domains, versus going to something where you have a single client, where it's a lot of contract work? How did that shift your business mindset?
Well, and just to clarify, so Register.com was B2C and B2B. So it started B2C. And we actually were the first to do B2B, meaning that it's a funny story. So a very quick sideline, and then I'll get into the Facile and government contracts. So we were focused on .com, .net, .org, way back when, right? That's what, and very quickly we realized, look, Coca-Cola, every GM, every single Fortune 500 company is going to need to protect their brand and need to get the domain names from all over the world. GM.fr, France, right? This sounds funny now, but back then, so each of the registrars were their own independent entity run by the government. And I said, we have to offer this service, B2B. We have to be the source where all these Fortune 500 companies come. They'll spend millions of dollars to protect their identities, but you couldn't just register online. You couldn't just go to the French government site and register .fr. So I sent 3 young guys out. I pulled them in and I said, "You're on the road for the next 60 days each. You're going east, you're going west, you're going south." And I said, "Don't come back until you each have the signed contracts and agreements and processes that we at Register.com can then do this for corporate clients." So anyway, that's a side for the B2B. So it was very different to focus on the government. And so there's the civilian side of the U.S. government, and then there's the defense side of the government. The defense side is much tougher from the perspective that you need clearances. There's a lot of security work, clearance work, but that's where the money is. And so it was a huge learning experience.
I want to go back to these 3 guys you sent off quickly.
Yeah, sure.
Were they successful in their journey? And
I said, "Do not come back."
Yeah, they had no choice.
They would not come back.
Well, how did you trust these guys? You must have done a long recruiting process maybe to get these 3 people that you had to trust in doing this for you.
James, so let me ask you, if you didn't know what you wanted to do, and you've joined this startup, Register.com, and you're new into your career, you're talking about people at universities, they're coming out, your first job out, and someone says you get to travel for the next 2 months on the company dime, you have to go figure it out. Yeah. We are an entrepreneurial company. No one's ever done this before. We are going to be the first ones. Yeah. Go figure it out. Cool. Does that sound?
Sign me up, yeah.
I know a lot of friends who would really like to do that.
It was an incredible assignment. Yeah. You die for an assignment like this, right? And it's don't ask me, you figure it out. Yeah. No one's done this. Yeah. You get to pave the way. Yeah. That's a very exciting assignment.
Yeah. Wow.
So tell us now, so you're founder, CEO of Facile. What's going on at this time? I know you were maybe contemplating a number of different businesses. Facile, how did that turn out? And then what kind of led you to the next point in your career?
Yeah, we can fast forward through Facile. It's so funny. I do laugh now that defense tech is so popular with VCs. Venture capital wouldn't touch defense tech, wouldn't touch government contractors with a 1,000,000-foot pole back between when the time we were doing it. No one got venture funding. Private equity would roll companies up. So it was completely organic, didn't take any venture funding. Just, it was a lot of hard work and pounding on doors and meeting people and going after a variety of different contracts. We had a saying that you always say yes, never say no. The only time we ever said no in the 15 years or 16 years that I was doing this is when someone wanted to give us a contract to do some work outside the space station that required walking outside the space station. I said, that's something we can't do. But just about everything else we said we could do. We grew Facile organically to about 1,000 employees, about 150 million in revenue, very profitable. And again, there weren't many exit strategies, so we weren't getting the valuation we wanted. It was time to move on. We had a full C-suite of execs. My business partner and I, Raf Collado, were like, look, we got to get back to doing something organically. And so we're started to get back to and started looking at a variety of different opportunities to start businesses in areas that we were interested in. And we sold the Facile to our employees. And then eventually that exited a couple years later to a private equity firm. But because it was a mature business and contracts are 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and because it was so mature, we said, look, back in 2012, 2013, we started looking around and said, what else can we do?
So what made you realize that it was time to leave? Was it just that, hey, this is getting to a point where it's like not as fun, not as like adventurous, or didn't you just had aspirations for something else? What kind of made you make the leap?
Yeah, I think we were bored. Right? We were bored. It was very mature. There were people running the company day to day. And it wasn't as exciting. We weren't building anymore. We weren't doing anything creative. And this was the time, again, going back to 2012, 2013, Uber was starting to explode in popularity. Airbnb was starting to explode in popularity. A lot of businesses here in Silicon Valley had gotten traction from the kind of 2007 period where we had the financial crash to that time. And we were looking at this saying, we gotta get back to this. Let's build something again. And that really was the impetus.
Yeah, I think now is an awesome time to transition to GetMyBoat. So for everyone watching GetMyBoat, you can kind of think about it. The simplest way to think about it is like an Airbnb for boats. People, oftentimes they'll have their boats sitting around and they won't be using them for 95% of the time. So for all that time, they can list it on GetMyBoat. They can get their boats rented out. They can have a captain go take their boat out. And it's a great way to make residual income from your boat. And it's a lot of fun for people if you're going to rent a boat. So to transition to that piece as well, it's a very interesting business. It's a very complex business. I know that there's the marketplace dynamics. You need both the buyer and sellers. You need, obviously there's probably a lot of details with commercial insurance, and then maybe even seasonality. So there's a lot of different obstacles there. But you're a vet at this point. You've done a few businesses. How did you think about that?
Well, so Bryce, I'm going to turn the tables up to you for a second here. So, and I know this is, we can get into GetMyBoat, but you have some experience with the boat rental market space.
Yes.
So what's your experience been?
Yeah, so I guess my first startup, Veho, for those who are watching, it didn't work very well. Do not try that as your first startup. You need to be a vet to do this. But my experience is that, one, I think it's just a super fun industry to be in. Like, boats it's something that's so fun. I know you have a cottage, like it's a really fun sort of business to think about. For me, a few of the big obstacles we encountered were with insurance, commercial insurance, and particularly what that does to the margins of the company. It costs more on a per boat basis, and in Canada we also have to deal with seasons a lot more, so that your window's a lot smaller. So I think definitely being down south, there's a lot of natural advantages for that. But yeah, that was I guess my experience in I guess that industry, and it's also a big reason why I reached out to Sascha, because I thought it'd be really cool to talk to the one guy who was really successful. Because when we were building this, it was more like Uber for boats. He was the Airbnb for boats, and he had his work. So I thought it'd be good all these years later to talk.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a hard business. Startups are hard. There's no way to kind of sugarcoat this. Startups are hard, and I always say this, it takes 10 years to be an overnight success. It takes 10 years. People say, well, I'll try it. Look, if you're really going to give it a go, it's going to take 10 years, maybe, to get successful. So the 2 points that you pointed out, seasonality being in Canada and insurance. I'll take seasonality first. So when we were interviewing the first person that came on board at GetMyBoat, who actually is now the president and chief operating officer, he's been here this whole time, he asked where he was going to focus. Was he going to focus on a couple markets? And I said, think bigger. And he said, okay, we'll focus on a state or a couple states. I said, think bigger. And he said, okay, well, we'll focus on a country. And I said, think bigger. Belaboring the point, but so in a seasonal business, one of the ways to mitigate that, and it's an audacious, crazy, nutso way to do this, is we just went global. Okay? And so if it's cold in Canada, it's warm in Central or South America, or certainly in the Mediterranean, etc. And so we tried to. There is a lot of seasonality with the business. We've stayed away from the Scandinavian countries. There are places in Canada that are super popular because it's seasonal. That's the mix of this is that you get a lot of customers coming out. So we always went global. We anticipated that demand was going to be constant around the globe, and no one had solved this problem, whether it was Canada, the US, or anywhere else. Nobody had provided an Airbnb or Uber for boats, but we believed that the demand was there no matter where the locale was. And to kind of smooth out seasonality, we went global. And we also were going for a land grab, and this was our third startup, so why not? Why not just go huge, right? Who cares at this point? So, nothing to lose. If it fails, it fails. But wanted to do something audacious and really game-changing. And then on the insurance part, and what we've learned is, so what you were solving for was an insurance issue, and that put you in the insurance game.
Yes.
We are in the marketplace game and technology, and we do have solutions now on the insurance side, but that is up to the boat owners, and that is not something that we've touched, and we've learned that is very, very problematic. Once you get into that, you become an insurance company, and so that's a problem.
Very interesting.
So you're not an insurance company, so how did you kind of convince your first couple customers that this was gonna work and that there wasn't liability and
to put their boats on the platform? That's a big jump. It's a huge asset.
And exactly, and so one of the initial components of this business was we were initially going to do obviously the peer-to-peer, the Airbnb aspect. We took the Uber black car approach that let's get charter companies, people that have registered their business that need access, because there was no access for charter companies to be online in a marketplace, and so that was kind of the key is that we said, let's focus on charter companies as well as individuals until we solve the individual insurance. But a lot of insurance companies allow individuals to rent out their boats a certain amount of times in the year for pay. Okay, and so we thought that the bigger issue, so this was kind of gets back to one of the lessons. So what are you solving for? We were trying to make a efficient way for renters and owners to meet and get people out on the water. And so the mechanics of that were, okay, well, we'll create a marketplace. How can we bring supply on? And so the easiest supply, the low-hanging fruit, happened to be charter companies. And many charter companies are mom and pops. They're on lakes. They're local on the coast. They only have 1 to 3 boats. And it's so hyper-fragmented. The bigger challenge is just consolidating that. And so that's how we got around that.
And how did you come to that realization? Was it just talking to charters, or how?
I mean, just being in the space, realizing that we had a potential issue with insurance, knowing the demand was there, talking to people that were willing to come on the platform, people that have businesses that are. I mean, every single person on the GetMyBoat platform, from an owner perspective, is a micro entrepreneur. They're a small business owner, they're a micro entrepreneur. There's the occasional larger business, but that's the industry. And so anything from their perspective that was going to increase visibility to their business and give them more customers is attractive.
Yeah.
It's very cool. I'm wondering where to go next here. I guess, staying on Get My Boat. I'd love to ask, I guess even your personal experience with Get My Boat. What's maybe one fun time when maybe you've rented or some of your friends have used your platform? Do you have any fun stories of that?
So I hate to be a killjoy. Every time I use the platform, I realize what more we need to do, right? And so it's never a perfect experience. The opportunity to create a seamless, magical experience for a renter and an owner that is as simple as renting an Uber or an Airbnb. It was always the goal. And so every time I've gone out, if there's boating is not the same. It's a very difficult business. The logistics of meeting people where docks are, getting to docks, parking, whether it's captain, not captain, food, catered, or, how long you're going to go out for, how much time is spent actually getting onto the ocean or out into the middle of the lake. What are you going to do? Getting back on time, tipping. What if you want to add an additional hour? How much fuel are you going to use? I mean, I could go on and on, right? It's so mechanizing that, making that magical, making that all seamless has been a 12-year journey. We're not quite there. We're almost there. But so every time, to answer your question, it's not fun from the perspective that every time I go out and do something, it's like, okay, what more do we need to do? Okay, we need to tackle that.
That can be stressful too, knowing that there's stuff that needs to be done. But yeah.
Well, it's frustrating. I don't call it stressful. I want a beautiful product, and that's the whole point of Get My Boat or Facile or register.com. I want people in today's world. Providing an incredible product and service is rare. And so again, I'll refer back to Uber. Uber really they created something that was incredibly magical going back to when they first were doing this, why they were so popular. You guys aren't as much used to it, and younger generation with taxi cabs was a horrible experience. It was the worst. Could never find one, having to pay cash, totally rude, broken down. They totally changed that. And so with the boating, getting people on the water, which is an incredibly emotional experience. You guys have boats. Every time you go out, it's a different experience, and it's a great experience, and it's a social experience. You're not going out by yourself. You're going out with friends or family, and making that accessible, democratizing boating, which also has a stigma, and making it super easy and seamless to use. And again, this is one of the challenges doing it either on the phone or a laptop or whatever. It's not stressful. It's frustrating because I want to deliver that and that promise. And that's the promise of Get My Boat, and it's really hard to do.
That's awesome. It's great that you guys you're almost fully satisfied with it.
Yes, I'm sure. I think I am, but I'm sure that will change.
Well, Sascha, we're down to our last 5 minutes here. So what I was thinking is maybe we just rapid fire as quick questions as possible. But before that, one question we ask all of our guests, and you can maybe elaborate a little bit more on this one. But put yourself in the shoes of me and Bryce. You've had experience across tons of different industries. You got into tech in your last business. Where do you think the right place to start your career is, or what advice would you have for us who are about to enter the workforce? What should we look for?
Well, I think you're doing it. I mean, you guys probably the wrong bit of advice, but this seems like an interest for you. You're starting a podcast. You just contacted me out of the blue. It's a microcosm of entrepreneurship. You are just picking up, the proverbial phone and saying, hey, can I interview? This is what we're doing. You're doing all the right things from that perspective, which is just to do something and in an area that interests you. Everyone says find your passion. Excuse my language, but bullshit, okay? You're going to have many passions in your life, but find an area of interest or an area of expertise or an area that you feel you want to contribute or be good in, and just pursue it. You guys are doing it. You are an example to your cohort of, if you have an interest, just do it, right? So many people hesitate or, well, I don't have an introduction to Sascha. I don't know him. But you guys have been interviewing people all week. Why? Because you just have the moxie to ask. And so I would encourage that. If you have an interest, something you want to do it. There's no excuse.
Yeah, that's really good advice.
Yeah.
I have a couple quick
Keep
ones.
going,
Okay. You seem to be very sporty. I'm just looking at all the photos around your office here. What sports do you do in your life right now? You obviously played lacrosse. What is it now?
It's biking. I've had a couple back surgeries that set me back pretty far. I ran the New York Marathon and then had some pretty serious back issues and thought I was not going to be able to do anything again. Very blessed. Now I do distance bike. I biked 45 miles this morning. And we live in a great area for that. So that's primarily what I do.
Yeah.
Keep going, James. Keep going.
What was your favorite place to travel?
I don't have a favorite. It's different places at different times. Africa was very influential on me as a kid. I did a service project in Haiti when I was in high school. I've taken my kids back to Africa. Obviously Japan, and coming full circle, GetMyBoat was acquired by a Japanese company, and so now I travel back to Tokyo and Osaka. Be where you're at, enjoy what you have, and it'll change. So it's the memories versus a place.
Yeah. What was your favorite book? Sorry to cut you off.
Keep going. Keep going.
Do you have any favorite books?
One of the more influential books when I was growing up was called The Power of One.
Any other inspirational figures in your life that you look up to?
I'll get emotional, but my dad, who's not with us, I think was probably the most inspirational person in my life and very supportive. So.
Yeah. And you now have children and now too, which is, I love looking at the photos around your office here, but having a family, has that been a pretty special thing as well?
Best thing in my life.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I've made a lot of career decisions that revolved around working from home and being with family much before this was in vogue, because I want to see my boys grow up. And when I say grow up, I wanted to drop them at school. I want to pick them up. I want to be a part of their life, which they may have a different view on that.
We're sort of grateful for that. Yeah.
Well, unless you have any other questions, Sascha, you've done an amazing job answering everything for us today.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.
And
is there any other advice that you'd like to give, or any, last comments for our audience?
No, I think Bryce and James, talking on this podcast, are examples of what's possible. Your generation lives in the most exciting time to be alive in the history of humanity, without a doubt. And I could go through all the statistics, but statistically speaking, I know that what gets press is what's wrong, what's right, and the opportunities, whether it's in biotech, in energy, in tech, in medicine. We are experiencing the most amount of growth and opportunities in industry by industry that we have ever seen in the history of humanity. And what is going to happen over the next 20 years to this world in terms of AI, in terms of driverless cars, in terms of renewable energy, in terms of vaccines, in terms of poverty levels being eradicated, in terms of the world shrinking, you can go anywhere, just opens up an endless amount of possibilities. Embrace these possibilities. Embrace whatever it is that you're interested in. This new form of media, podcasting, it's not that new, I know, but you guys are starting a social media business. You can do whatever you want. You're only limited by your imagination. It may be a winding road. My road certainly wasn't straight. It wasn't through investment banking or consulting. Right? Right. But sign up for the journey. Yeah. And there's going to be a lot of hardship, but it's very rewarding if you realize that this is just an incredible time, and just embrace things. Yeah. Embrace it. Just go for it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having us, Sascha. The fact that you're able to invite two random people into your home to interview you is a testament to everything you've been saying today.
I think it speaks to you guys. Be persistent.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, Sascha.